Now it is time to introduce our main speaker for tonight, June.
Hi, my name's June, and I'm an alcoholic. Hi. I want to thank Alan for inviting me, and I want to welcome those of you who are new, those of you who stood up, and maybe those of you who didn't yet. I want to welcome anyone who might be visiting Alcoholics Anonymous. You know, I have an opportunity to talk fairly often. It varies, but there are certain things I like to try and say in the very beginning when I'm asked to share in a meeting. Partly because I've always suffered from an extremely short attention span, where I can only hear maybe the first 2 or 3 things, and then I have to start thinking about me. So in case anybody else is like that, and especially if you're new or visiting, I want to start by telling you that I am not an expert on alcoholism, Alcoholics Anonymous, or certainly anything else I'll be talking about tonight. I'm just a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm going to stand up here, as many of the people already did that took cakes, and Amy did earlier, and share, maybe for a little bit longer, as the big book suggests that we do, about what it was like, what happened, what it's like today. I think that it's really important for me to remember to tell you, in case you're new or visiting, that Alcoholics Anonymous is absolutely free. Many people these days, come in through treatment programs or insurance programs or hospitals, and I really don't think it matters how you get into Alcoholics Anonymous at all. But I want to be very clear about the fact that Alcoholics Anonymous itself is absolutely free. Had Alcoholics Anonymous not been free, I never could have come here. I was well over 10 years sober in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous before I could afford to put $1 in the basket. So this is not about money, and I just want to be sure that you know that, and don't worry about that part of it. I also want you to know that nobody gets paid to stand up and talk in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. I want you to know that for a couple reasons, because afterwards when you're sitting at coffee and you're saying, geez, you had to pay her for that, I want you to know I didn't get paid. But more importantly, because, Alcoholics Anonymous, it's all about just being sober. And, there is nothing that anyone, I believe, in Alcoholics Anonymous does that is really any more important than what anyone else does. And, I was thinking about it tonight. I really want to thank you for having the job of not letting the people in who want to come in, when the meeting has already started, because, that's not a popular job, I imagine. I don't, I think there's some people who are going to have to pray for you later, who are on the side saying, come on. I was whatever. But I appreciate that, and I appreciate what Amy said about asking people to be quiet and respectful in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, because I'll tell you, Alcoholics Anonymous has saved my life. And I come to meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I need them as much today as I ever have. And it's been really hard sometimes when I'm trying to sit in a meeting and I'm having a hard time, and maybe people have looked at me and thought, oh, for crying out loud, she's been sober for a while, or she's got a job or a car now, which I certainly didn't have in the early many, many years of my sobriety. And so maybe they think you're not having a hard time. But you know what? I really believe that Alcoholics Anonymous is all about living life. And I suspect that on any given day, in any room of Alcoholics Anonymous, each of us are experiencing life. And sometimes it's fabulous. And sometimes it's really hard, just like the birthday people shared about, And I come to Alcoholics Anonymous, I heard someone say one time, it's sort of like checking my message machine. I don't believe that Alcoholics Anonymous is the only place that people can hear things. I really am much more broad-minded today than I was, I think, in the early years. I know there's lots of wonderful people and places to get spiritual information. But for me, when I come to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, it's like checking my message machine. This is where I need to hear what I need to hear. And, I don't like everybody in Alcoholics Anonymous. I heard someone else say, if you like everyone in AA, you're not going to enough meetings. So, but it's really not about that, I am a person today that I wouldn't have even liked, and I live today a life that I never would have wanted anything to do with. And it absolutely fascinates me that Alcoholics Anonymous has led me to that spot, And I don't think it makes any sense, really, for me to tell you about my life today, unless I do sort of tell you a little bit about what it was like. I'm one of those people that believes I was born an alcoholic, and I don't want to have a philosophical discussion about that with anybody after the meeting. It's just what I believe. I I talked at a meeting, it's been a few years ago now, over at 26th and Broadway, and this guy came up to me afterwards to thank me, mostly because his sponsor was standing behind him and made him, and he said, I want to thank you for your talk tonight. He said, I thought that was a pretty good talk. He said, I don't really believe that was your story, but I liked the way that you told it. And I've never forgotten that, because I thought, it's only in AA that we'd be so paranoid, when we're new, that we'd think, oh, they make it up, and, they kind of do this and that, and then they kind of bring it in, to the meeting, and like they have nothing else to do. You go to meetings for 10 years so you can get up and tell a story, But anyway, the thing that really impressed me about that was I thought, this guy does not believe that I came from where I came from. And it's so fascinating to me because, you know what, when I walked through the doors of Alcoholics Anonymous, I looked like my story. And I looked like my story for a hell of a long time after I came in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. So I thought, what a credit to Alcoholics Anonymous that someone could doubt that I came from where I did. Let's see, I grew up in an alcoholic home. There was a lot of the same kind of things that go on in a lot of alcoholic homes that went on in my home. There was a lot of violence. There was a lot of broken promises. There was a lot of different kinds of abuse. There was a lot of sadness. As I was growing up, I know today that most of the people that I was looking at were alcoholics, because that's who my mom hung out with. But I didn't know that, of course, for a long, long time. And before coming to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, I do not ever remember seeing a man cry under any circumstances. I've seen men shot. I've seen them stabbed. Excuse me. I've seen them arrested. I've seen their wives leave them. I've seen their kids overdose. I've seen a lot of things happen. And I never saw a man shed a tear under any of those circumstances. I saw the women in my life go through all of those exact same events. Some of them didn't cry, but most of them seemed to have a breaking point. One of those things or the other would break them, and they just couldn't handle it, and they would cry and fall apart and be weak, as I saw it. And so I looked at those two different groups of people, and I decided right away which group I wanted to go with. I wanted to go with the I don't feel pain group, which I thought was the guys, And when I was a little kid, they'd ask me, as people frequently do, well, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I said, a boy. And it wasn't as easy to do back then as it is today, but I was, and you may think I was kidding, but apparently I disturbed enough people with my comments that they actually began to take me first to priests, and then later to psychologists and even psychiatrists. We were on welfare. And I had a lot of other, weird behaviors because, actually drinking and using was not my first obsession. My first obsession, sort of like Amy was, sharing a little bit about, my first obsession was suicide. And from the time that I was 5 years old, I began to try and kill myself on a regular basis. And I have to tell you that before I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, I don't think there was a single day that went by that I didn't try and take my own life, put myself in a position where someone else would take my life, or pray to a God that I was slowly losing faith in to let me die. I wanted out. And I am so grateful that I found alcohol and the chemicals that I was going to mix with it. I started to use drugs on a regular basis at 7. I grew up in Venice. By the time I was 8, I was drinking. And by the time I was 9, I found the combination that I never altered, and it was barbiturates or downers or reds or yellows, whatever you might know them as, and alcohol. I've never had a social drink in my life. I never wanted one. I have never not gotten drunk. I have almost never, I think, not overdosed. What would be the point? I wasn't really trying to feel good out there, and I don't have a lot of fun party stories that I know so many people in Alcoholics Anonymous did have. I wasn't trying to feel good. I wanted to not feel anything at all, and thank God it worked that way for me for a little while, because I really believe, had I not found the relief that I got from alcohol and the chemicals that I mixed with it, I think I would have had to have been locked up in some kind of an institution. I couldn't take it out there. Life just hurt way too much for me. It's interesting, I've mentioned, that I wanted to be like the guy side, the no pain side. But sadly for me, having set that goal for myself, I seemed to actually be one of those people who was oversensitive. So that absolute strangers could look at me funny and it hurt my feelings, let alone when I got to school and they started to tease me about being tall and skinny and having curly red hair and, all of that stuff. I just could not handle it at all. And I started, learning things. I learned that, I would much rather you punch me in the face than hurt my feelings. And let me just say the short version, I was very good at getting my face punched in, and I did it all the time, because I just wanted to be real sure that we just started with that. you know. In growing up in Venice, when I kind of realized I wasn't going to be able to be a boy, the only thing I thought that could possibly work was to try and be a tough broad. And that's what I spent all my time trying to do before I came into AA, and for a long time afterwards, I might add. I didn't quite give that up right away. I've learned as I've traveled, sometimes in AA, because, you meet tough broads from all different parts of the country, and there are different, types of tough broads, and there's, makeup wearing tough broads, and then there are the non-makeup wearing tough broads, So I was a non-makeup wearing tough broad because I didn't want to look in a mirror long enough to see who I was and what I was. So makeup was just not a happening thing for me at all. I was, in Venice, it was really important that you never wear shoes if you were a tough broad because, tough broads have tough feet. It's very important, that you can walk down an alley with glass there and not stop at all. Just walk right through it. Yeah, you might get cut, but you don't let anybody know for a while, And then you take your cigarette when touristy-looking people are looking at you, and you throw it down on the boardwalk, and you put it out with your bare feet. And, you'll see touristy-looking people looking at you, and I knew what those people were saying. They were saying, wow, that is one tough broad. And I was very impressed that I could do this, and I assumed that they would have the same reaction, After I'd been sober for a while, my sponsor explained to me that, maybe what some of those people were saying is, that person just put flesh to fire. Why would anybody do anything so stupid, But I didn't know there was another way of looking at it, It was just, I thought that was just a black and white issue, I did a lot of fighting because that's, that was an important part, I thought. But I want to let you know that I've never won a fight in my life. But I've also never fought less than 5 people at a time. And again, my sponsor explained to me, if you fight one person and you lose, someone might say, you're not very good. If you always fight groups of 5 or more, no one expects you to win. And some people think you might be pretty tough, or why would that many people have had to jump you? So it was just this thing, that, and hence the fact that my face was beat up a lot as I walked around. But anyway, I was brought to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous by my mom, and my mom was one of the slippers in Alcoholics Anonymous that people hear a lot about, I suppose. And my mom was in and out of the program of Alcoholics Anonymous for many, many years with varying lengths of sobriety. And I'll tell you, the one thing about watching that is that I have never doubted for 1 minute when it shares in the book about the fact that this is a progressive disease. I saw things change in our life in 24 hours, from 2 years of sobriety that my mom had, where she had a job and she was just, everything. We had an apartment. We actually had the gas, the phone, and the lights all on at the same time. I mean, things were looking up, and she went out one night and had a glass of brandy. And I remember saying to her, that was one of the times when I was a kid, and I go, Mom, I thought you're not supposed to drink anything in that AA. She goes, oh, no, brandy, She said, I always drank in the beer bars in Venice. Brandy is fine. It's classy. I thought, okay, And I came home the next day, and there were 6 guys passed out in our apartment, beer and bottles and, heroin stuff all over the house. And her new boyfriend, who'd just gotten out of prison that day for killing his girlfriend, was living with us. And I mean, we're talking 24 hours, So I know that alcoholism is a progressive disease. Anyway, my mom brought me to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous when she was coming back one more time. And I didn't want to join AA. I mean, I didn't want to join any organization that was allowing my mother to belong to it. I think, by the time I did come to AA, the only person I hated more than my mother was myself. I blame my mother for everything that had ever gone wrong in my life, and take it from me, the short version, a lot had gone wrong. Anyway, she brought me to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. I did not raise my hand. I did not ask for help because I really didn't believe that I had a problem. I wasn't anything like her. And that night at the meeting, the miracle of the program began for me, even though I didn't get sober then. And it began because there was a guy in that meeting that I admired more than anybody else in the entire world. And I did not admire very many people. But this guy was actually a drinking friend of my mother's. And, you know, if I had to tell you what I wanted out of life in one sentence when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, I wanted the ability to walk into a room full of strangers and have everyone there back away from me in terror. And when you're 87 pounds, that almost never happens, you know. But that's kind of what I was hoping for in life, you know. And this guy, Paul, who was a drinking friend of my mom's, you know, he was at the meeting that night, and, you know, he had his tattoos, he had, you know, his motorcycle outside, and he had his knife with him at the meeting. And, you know, I had seen him in the bars in Venice, and when Paul had started drinking, if he wanted to sit at your table, you gave him the whole table. You didn't even bother talking, because you just didn't know how crazy he was going to get the table. And so I looked at this man who had achieved everything that I wanted in life, the ability to clear, you know, a tough barroom table. And he was sitting in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. I was very impressed. I thought maybe it's not just for weak people like my mom, you know, because my mom was kind of like me. She lost every fight, you know, I ever saw her in. So it impressed me that this guy was here. And I got drunk the next night, and then I came back to some meetings, and I didn't raise my hand because I wasn't an alcoholic. I was far too young to be an alcoholic. You know, I had places to go, people to see, things to do. I had my whole life ahead of me. I wasn't anything like my mother. I was really not alcoholic. You know, I may have had a little issue with some drug things because, you know, that's kind of cooler, but you know, not the alcoholic thing. And so, you know, the only person that I thought was cool enough for me to talk to was this guy, Paul. So in between meetings, I would talk to him. I didn't talk to anybody else. And, you know, I explained to Paul, I said, you know, I'm not an alcoholic. I'm, you know, too young to be an alcoholic. I'm not anything like my mom, who's an alcoholic. I never act like my mom, who's an alcoholic. You know, I'm not like these other alcoholics. I'm really not alcoholic. And I later found out that non-alcoholics don't have to spend any time trying to convince other people that they're not alcoholic. You know, they already know that. And you know, he turned to me and he said, you know, June, I'm new in this AA thing. And he said, they've told me I can't diagnose anybody's disease but my own. He said, but in your case, I'm going to make an exception. He said, I've seen the way that you drink, and I've seen the way that you use pills. And he said, I happen to believe if you don't come into this program and take what these people have to offer you within a period of 6 months or less, you're going to be out on the streets, you're going to be shooting stuff, and you're going to be selling your ass. And he wasn't like trying to make up some story, you know, that like a high school teacher might do to scare the kids. He was just talking about facts. He was talking about things that were happening and beginning to happen in my life. And I thought a little bit about what he said, but I did not want to join Alcoholics Anonymous. I did not think it could be that bad, you know. And yet in that 2-week period of time, absolutely every alternative but Alcoholics Anonymous was removed from my life. I've already mentioned, you know, how I felt about myself and my mother, and I was filled with a lot of anger and rage and hatred. And I used to attack my mom. I mean, you know, she attacked me too sometimes, but I mean, there was a lot of physical stuff that went on, and my mom didn't think she had to be attacked anymore now that she was getting sober in her own apartment, and she asked me to leave, and I did. The rest of my family didn't want me to come by under any circumstances, and I didn't bother trying. I had been in a lot of foster homes, and none of them would take me back. I tried to get into some drug rehab and alcohol recovery homes that were in LA at that time. There weren't very many, but none of them would take me, some because of my age and some just because of my attitude. There was a program back then called Synanon, and they were desperate for membership at the time, and they wouldn't even take me. And so things were looking kind of bad, but I thought, you know what, who cares? Who cares about those programs? Who cares about that family stuff? Because you know what, none of that really matters. If you're a tough broad, the only thing that really counts and that's important is your own gang. And then one day as I walked down an alley, all 5 members of my own gang beat me up. And so I found myself sitting in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, and you know, I didn't have any friends, I didn't have any family, I didn't have any place to live, I didn't have any shoes. Wouldn't have worn them if I'd had them at the time, but I didn't. And so I raised my hand in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. It wasn't like, you know, would you like to go to Hawaii or join AA? I mean, it was just a much easier decision right then, you know. And I raised my hand. I know today that some of those people in the meeting did not know about the traditions of Alcoholics Anonymous, specifically the 3rd tradition, the one that says the only requirement for AA membership is a desire to stop drinking. And the reason I'm pretty sure they didn't know about that tradition is that when I first started to raise my hand, some people knew who I was and how old I was, because my mother had been in and out of meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous and bringing me off and on for so many years. And they came over to me and they said, you know, we don't want a little kid in our meeting. And we want to talk about serious things. And if you come back, we're going to get together and throw you out. I didn't know that AA had a tradition that said nobody could do that. I just figured AA didn't want me either. And that was okay with me, because I didn't want me either. And I hadn't for a long, long time. So I fell back on the number one answer that I've been using since I was 5 years old. I went over to a friend of my mother's house. I went into her bathroom, which is the first place I went at anyone's house I ever visited. I found enough of the kind of pills I needed to kill myself, and I took enough of them to do it one more time. And before I passed out that day, I went to a noon meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. And by the time I got to that meeting, I could not stand and I could not sit. I was only capable of laying in the meeting. And, you know, I got sober in West LA. We almost never called on people, and still don't, who are laying in the meeting. But that day, for whatever reason, they called on me. I certainly don't know what I said, but they realized I needed to be in a hospital, and that was where I came to, with the doctor explaining to me that the pills I had taken were to slow down my heart, and had I been there 5 or 10 minutes later, I would have been in a coma that they probably couldn't have brought me out of. And I really can't tell you exactly why that overdose was any different than all the others that I inflicted upon myself. I just know that it was. Because since that day, one day at a time, I haven't taken anything that affects me from the neck up. And that's how I personally define sobriety. You know, it would be a better story, I suppose, if I could tell you that once I decided to join Alcoholics Anonymous, I was able to be grateful for the wonderful kindness that was offered to me here in Alcoholics Anonymous. But that's not my story. So what I need to remember is that I need to remember to be very, very grateful for the tolerance that the people in Alcoholics Anonymous showed me, especially the old-timers. Because I came into Alcoholics Anonymous, and this may not surprise you, but I came into Alcoholics Anonymous with a very bad attitude. I did not like me. I didn't like my mother. I figured any other women around here were probably like one of the two of us, and I didn't like them. I didn't like sitting next to women. I didn't like shaking hands with women. I most certainly did not hug women, and I did not like listening to women speakers, which always makes me feel better because I know there are never as many people listening to me as it looks like. The only men I'd really known in my life were alcoholic, and most of them were extremely violent. Figured if the guys in here were alcoholic, they were probably extremely violent, and I didn't want anything to do with them either. And so I had a problem, because when I came into Alcoholics Anonymous in July of 1972, all they had were men and women, and I didn't like any of them. But I went to 21 meetings a week anyway for the first, most of the first 3 years that I was sober. And I had a commitment at most of those meetings. And I did not have a commitment because I wanted to get a gold star in AA. I had a commitment because I was scared this wasn't going to work for me. Because I never stayed sober in Alcoholics Anonymous in the hard times, in the early days, because I was afraid I might go out there and die. Because I tried to die as long and as hard as I could. What's kept me in Alcoholics Anonymous is the thought that maybe I could go back out there and live the way that I was living. And by the time I walked through the doors of Alcoholics Anonymous, I could not have gone on breathing in and out 2 more times, hating myself any more than I did. It's just inconceivable to me that it could have gotten any lower than the way that I felt. So I needed to feel like maybe I had a chance to stay, and it seemed like maybe that was a way to get it. I had no family. I had no place to live. I had no one that wanted to spend any time with me at all, and I so understand that today. You know, I didn't wear shoes most of the first 2 years that I was sober. I wore a motorcycle jacket that on the back said, "Do unto others," and then split. It was my own form of spirituality. I wore motorcycle chains around my wrist and my ankle. I smoked 3 packs of cigarettes a day, and I lit all of them myself. Occasionally, someone would hold a match, and I allowed them to hold it as long as they liked, but they didn't light my cigarette with it. Sometimes someone would hold a door open for me, and I'd let them hold it until they got tired. And when it closed, I would open it for myself only, and I would go in. After I'd been sober a little while, I took up smoking cigars and then later a pipe. I had a very limited vocabulary when I came to AA. Mostly profanity. There were a few exceptions, the and mother. And I found a lot of people in Alcoholics Anonymous were extremely offended by the type of language that I used. So I tried to use it more if they got near me. And I want to let you know, if you choose to act that way, dress that way, smoke that way, you too can sit in a meeting almost this big and have an entire row all to yourself. It so fascinates me, and I was thinking about it today, and I think I'll go ahead and talk about this a little bit, and then we'll see where we go from there. But my sponsor so fascinates me, that she became my sponsor. First of all, she, it's like a woman. I've already mentioned I had a little bit of attitude about that whole area. But, I believe when I think of my sponsor, I am fully convinced that about the line in the book that says, we are people who normally would not mix. My sponsor, Gail Wilson, became my sponsor in the fairly early, probably months of my sobriety, mainly because as I went to those 21 meetings a week, it seemed to me that Gail Wilson spoke at about 18 of them every week. It was driving me crazy. I couldn't get away from this lady. She talked everywhere, and I didn't even have a car. I'm hitchhiking, riding buses, walking, and I kept going to different meetings, and she's always there, And so I thought to myself, perhaps if I ask her to be my sponsor, I'll be able to find out ahead of time where she's speaking, and then I won't have to go hear her all the time, And so that was my motivation for getting a sponsor, Gail was 3 times my age. She was from the South. I didn't like people from the South. She had a car. We never had a car. She had a mother and a father. I didn't have a dad, and I didn't like people like that. She had a warm, loving family. I really hated people like that. She'd gone to college. Well, I had a problem with that. She'd been a stewardess and traveled the world. Like, great, And as if all of that, not only did Gail not use the same kind of language that I was using, she didn't know what a lot of the words I was using meant. I had to transcribe for her, when I'm like when I'm cussing. She's like, what are you, And as if all of that wasn't bad enough, she was actually seen on numerous occasions in public wearing pink. I didn't even sit in a row where there was anything pink until I was close to 10 years sober. I had a real problem with pink. But anyway, and I would see Gail. Her home group was the Thursday night Brentwood group, and I would see Gail at the meeting, and I'd go say hi, and she'd say, now look, June, don't tell anyone that I am your sponsor. And I'd say, okay. And she said, and please don't sit next to me at the meeting tonight. I can't take the cigar smoke, So I would go, and, we would meet secretly after the meeting and talk about AA, When I can remember I was the greeter at the Tuesday night Westwood meeting. That was one of my commitments. And I would stand at the door with my motorcycle jacket and cigars, barefoot, welcoming the newcomers as they came to AA. And I really had a lot of problems with my brain. I couldn't remember things, and I couldn't carry on conversations, and I still saw and heard things. I heard music for a long time, and I saw things suddenly, So it really bothered people. But anyway, I stood there as the greeter, and sometimes I'd hear people walking by, and they'd say, if you keep drinking, you can end up like that, When I came in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous with my black eye and my swollen lip and, my attitude and everything else that I brought, people were guessing my age at 37. I was 13. And I felt at least 1,000 years older than I feel today. And I'll tell you, I was so old when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous that there wasn't anyone here or everyone put together that could have ever convinced me that I wouldn't always feel old. It was just so over. It was just, I didn't have any dreams. I didn't want to do anything. I really wanted to die, and I couldn't even seem to do that, so I thought I'm just going to be trapped, in Alcoholics I have a 7th grade education. I dropped out of school. Tried to go back briefly after I got in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, and it may not surprise you that I didn't quite fit in. It just didn't work. You know, they didn't like my cigarettes, my cigars. They wanted me to wear shoes. You know, there were all kinds of problems. So instead, you know, and I had all kinds of legal problems, and you know, I got thrown out of the state, and my mom, she got drunk again and turned me into the immigration authorities for being illegally in the country, which I was. And so, you know, I mean, there were like all kinds of stuff happening in the early years of my sobriety. It was just so drama. It was great. I remember thinking, you know, I was talking to somebody lately, there was a song, you know, back around then, I don't know my dates and stuff, but, you know, it was this Carly Simon song, and it was, you know, I haven't got time for the pain. And I always think about that song because I always had time for the pain, you know. I mean, really, you know, I mean, in the early years of my sobriety, people are like, you want to go to coffee? No, I need to go home. I've got to get back to the pain, you know. So and I can remember my sponsor telling me, you know, you have never had a problem yet that has been as bad as your solution for it, you know. And that's why I think sponsors are so important, you know, because it is so fascinating to hear our solutions sometimes, you know. Anyway, let's see. Well, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to talk a little bit more about Gail. You know, Gail was just one of those really practical people. I'm not saying that she was not spiritual, because she was, but she was just really practical. And she told me that, you know, if I wanted to do something, that I had to do the same footwork that anybody in or out of Alcoholics Anonymous had to do. She just really didn't believe I could just sit at the club and wait for a major corporation to call me up and, you know, offer me a presidency in that corporation, even if I was like a really good AA. She just didn't believe that that sort of thing was going to happen very often. So she told me, you know, if I wasn't going to go back to school, that I was going to get the kind of jobs that people with 7th grade educations get. And that is what I got. And I worked graveyard shifts, and I worked split shifts, and I worked all different kinds of jobs. And I didn't keep them very long. I was a huge flake. I had no show-upism in anything, you know, except AA. And I kept my commitments in AA, you know, and I never didn't show up. I never didn't call if I couldn't show up. I just knew that for me, it had to be that way. But in every other area of my life, everything, you know, I'd be at work, and I just wouldn't be having a good day. And I would say to my boss, you know, I need to leave. I need to go to a meeting. I'm an alcoholic, you know. And believe it or not, they just weren't like sympathetic, and, you know, they'd like fire me, you know. And I can remember trying to work the principles in the early months. You know, I'd go to coffee with everybody after the meeting, and I'd stay up till like 2 in the morning, and then I'd come home and I'd say, okay, now God, you know, I'm trying to work this God thing out. Okay, I'm supposed to be at work tomorrow at 6:30. So if it's your will for me to work at this job, make sure I'm awake. And it was not God's will for me to work there, clearly, because I never woke up at that time. You know, and there were just a lot of those kind of things. But anyway, and this, you know, Gail was just flabbergasted at my thinking, you know, and I can remember trying to talk to her about, like, lying. She thought a lot of the things I did were lying. And I really did not believe that they were lying. I would not give you all the information. And I didn't think that was lying because you didn't ask the right questions. I didn't lie. I'd call work and say, my car won't start. They didn't ask, did I put the key in and try and turn it? It just won't start, you know. And I had a million of those. And Gail was just convinced that I was dishonest and a liar, you know. So we really had a lot of discussions about character. And I thought Gail just didn't have any street sense, you know. And I remember, you know, I was thinking about this tonight. I thought, you know, one of the things, and one of the greatest things, you know, that has come true for me, and it was such a long time in coming true. But I remember Gail telling me that there was a difference between being tough and being strong. And I thought she was trying to pull some of that fancy college stuff, you know, using different words, you know. I mean, I go, no, there isn't. She goes, yes, there is. There's such a difference between being tough and being strong, you know. And today I understand what she's saying. It has finally happened for me through the process of Alcoholics Anonymous. I am stronger than I have ever been, and yet there are more people in the world who could hurt my feelings like that, and they know it. And it's the weirdest thing, because I, for so long, tried to make sure that nobody knew that I cared, that nobody knew how I was feeling, and somehow through the process of Alcoholics Anonymous, I've been able to give up those old ideas. But it was a really long process. Anyway, I eventually, I went back to school, mainly because I wanted to take this, they called it a dummy English class. I wanted to learn how to read again. And I took this class, and then while I was there, I took another class. And so I took a couple of classes. And then after a while, I got a chance to work in the school cafeteria and in the school library, and I applied for a student loan. And so I was able to take more classes and then work some weekend jobs. And so I started taking more classes. And after a while, they called me in, and they told me that I'd finished all the requirements for what they called an AA college degree. I thought that was a good name for a college degree. I never planned on getting a college degree. I still didn't have a high school degree, but I thought that was pretty cool. And they helped me set up for the GED test, and stuff, so I'd get all that, my high school equivalency exam and stuff. And then I decided I wanted to go on and go to a university. And I went ahead and I made these applications, and I ended up getting in to a university. And I just kept showing up like I'd been taught to do in AA and trying to do the best I could. And then, it's been a while now. I don't know, I think almost 20 years ago now. I don't know. But anyway, I got a telegram because I kept doing this footwork that Gail told me I had to do if I had a dream. And so I got this telegram, and it said that I was chosen as one of 300 out of 3,000 applicants to go to law school. And I'll tell you, I always planned on spending a lot of time in court. But never on that side of the table, And it was an absolutely fascinating experience to go to law school. And I learned more spiritually than I ever did intellectually, because it was a really important time for me to remember some of the things to learn, some of the things that Amy was talking about. It took me a lot longer to start learning those lessons, that I was one of God's kids, and that I wasn't any better than any of those kids, and I wasn't any worse than any of those kids, Because at first it seemed like I didn't even know a lawyer. I knew one lawyer in AA, and it was like everybody else seemed to be, like at least like a seventh generation, lawyer, and they were just whipping off these terms, like this and that, and I didn't know a thing. But I just kept showing up, and today I have a job that I love very, very much, and it's a job where I honestly believe I'm able to be of service. It's kind of funny, I've worked there for a while, and after I had worked there for a while, my boss called me in, and he said, we'd like to put you in charge of training the new lawyers that we're hiring. He said, because we really like your attitude. That's, the kind of, you got to call your sponsor, hey, guess what? Whoever thought I'd get a job for my attitude, Anyway, right before I graduated law school, though, my sponsor, Gail, who was in her 40s, we learned that she had a very serious type of cancer, and she was very, very sick. I spent a lot of time in the hospital with her at Cedars. So did a lot of other people. And, while I was there, we talked a lot about things. We talked, of course, about, hey, Gail, why did you become my sponsor? And she said, you know what? I became your sponsor because I was told to never say no to an AA request. She said, when you asked me to be your sponsor, she said, I knew you weren't going to make it. She said, I knew you were never going anywhere. She said, with your attitude and your background, she said, I wasn't sure it was really worth my time, but I was told not to say no to an AA request. And while she was there, all these nurses and people would come in to give her different stuff, whatever, and she'd stop every one of them and say, excuse me, Nurse Smith, I want you to meet Junie. She said, Junie's like a daughter to me, and Junie's going to be a lawyer. And I thought, this is the same woman who used to say, don't sit next to me at the meeting, and don't tell anyone that I am your sponsor, And we talked about, that whole thing, about, why she became my sponsor, and, that thing, and she said, you know what? She said, the idea wasn't that she ever believed anything about June. You know, she didn't believe June could do anything. She said, I remember when you called me and you said, I'm going to take a class over at school. She said, I knew you'd never finish. You hadn't finished anything. You hadn't kept a job more than about a week, you know, the whole time you'd been sober. She said, but I didn't say anything to you. And she said, and then I remember, you know, after you'd taken a couple of classes, you called and you said, you know, Gail, I think I'm going to sign up for college. And she said, I knew you'd never finish that. You know, I couldn't even convince you to go to high school and finish your classes. You know, she said, I knew you wouldn't do it. But she said she didn't say anything. And then she said, and I remember not that long after you started college, you called me up and you said, Gail, I think I have a dream. I think I want to go be a lawyer. She said, I had to force myself not to laugh out loud. She said, you know, that was 7 years away. I knew that wasn't going to happen for you. And when we talked about this, you know, why she didn't say anything. Because clearly, you know, she knew June wasn't capable of any of that. And she said, you know, she never believed in June, but she always believed in Alcoholics Anonymous because she had seen things happen here that just don't seem to really be supposed to happen. And that's why she didn't say it couldn't, because she just really didn't know. You know, there was a guy in the early days of my sobriety, and I love speaker meetings still, and I always have, and it's one of the reasons that I show up, even though, like Amy, there's 100 things I'd rather do tonight than stand up here and share, really. But they've meant so much to me. And when I came into the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, one of the old-timers that was here was a guy named Norm Alpe. And I encourage you to get a tape sometime if you're into that kind of thing, because for me, he was one of the greatest speakers I've ever heard in my life. And every time I ever heard Norm Alpe, right after I heard him, I'd think, I want to join AA. And then I'd remember I already belonged, or I wouldn't have been there hearing him. You know, I mean, it was just amazing. And one of the things that Norm would talk about is he would say, you know, but for the grace of God, people like you, rooms like this, I could have missed it all. Thanks for not letting me.